There are different types of relational awareness. Seems like everything with a cell wall has senses and reactions to the world around it, and thus has some relational capacity, if only externally. So, moving from that level of single cell organism or whole on within a larger system that has some impetus to perform a function but also just stay alive, as evidenced by the attempts of such things to do so when cut from sustenance. But as the size and complexity of the organism increases, then there is another type of relational awareness that emerges, and that is a conceptual self that relates to the world around it. It's likely that elephants have some kind of mental narrative going on. They exhibit behavior that commemorates the dead somehow, pilgrimages that aren't necessarily like just going to the salt lick or something. Who knows to what extent, but as far as we know, the extreme on that continuum would be us. So consider your inner life. You have an idea of a person who relates to ideas of other people, and people typically play out scenarios and relive scenarios and extrapolate scenarios. That kind of relational awareness that is extremely granular with respect to the qualia. There's just a lot. All possibilities, or many possibilities, are played out. That type of relational awareness manifests a different kind of outward behavior versus the animals who, for the most part, relate directly to what's going on in the moment. The human state of duality, so where there's a perception of a cell wall, there's perception of duality, and when there's perception of duality, with enough complexity in the brain, then a conceptual self is born of that. But when so many things can be gamed out in the mind, it creates novelty. Somehow novelty is generated. Animals can only go so far with novelty. There's a set of tools available that is just finite, and they can reshape them. Like we see certain primates and birds using objects, even like beavers and bees. I mean, they use the world around them to create things and synthesize things, but there's no change within the lifetime of such an animal. Like, we can't identify some innovative beaver, and then, you know, there's no cultural transmission necessarily between beavers, although I suppose a behavior could make its way through over many generations. But they are basically circular in the way that they operate. So you have this planet that has all these beings that just operate through a selection process, a set of behaviors that just by selection are conducive in traits to survival. So traits and behaviors that are conducive to survival and thus are selected for through a process of procreation, and everything operates within the system. In that it's circular, and that like atoms aren't rearranged or anything like that, and nothing really novel appears. It's all a process of just evolution. And then comes this type of relational awareness that can imagine a deviation from that. We don't know if that has emerged and reemerged after disappearing, because there's a dimension in which humans operate that makes them linear. We don't. There are certain things that we don't repeat. There are things that we repeat, and there are things that we don't repeat. And the arc of technological process progress. The arc of technological progress is not circular. Whereas many other things about us are. Like, I often, in practically every video, say that in the aggregate, people don't change. And that's why we see these repeated patterns through history, because the individual has an operating system that is going to behave in a similar way in repeated trials. It's going to react to circumstances in a certain way. It's going to have certain priorities. And those priorities, they will appear in different contexts depending on technology. And so cultures can manifest around that. But the priorities are the same, and those are survival. But it's like, if we were an animal and this were our wild environment, we'd be living in an environment where like the laws of physics are always changing, because every generation has to see the world that formed its mind become, fall away, and all the conditioning that was in place to operate in that world becomes obsolete, right? And that process goes faster and faster as technology accelerates. So humans, it's like we have to adapt not just to change, but the rate of change, the rate at which the rate of change changes. So we just do things more efficiently with technology. Everything we do, just about, we can do more efficiently. That seems to be kind of the output of technology is productivity, regardless of whether or not it's a physical thing or a mental thing. So there's something in the technological equation, though, that doesn't change, and that's the hardware of the human being. Um, so no matter what technology does, if it's just not compatible with human beings, it it will likely not catch on. Like, just because something can be invented doesn't mean that we're going to to use it. The problem with that, as it relates to, I guess, the greater good, is if too few people have too much power to impose such things on the wider population, then it kind of gets astroturfed, and it can put people into an unnatural situation. It makes me think of, I think it was the Universe 25 experiment. I think that was the name of it. I mentioned it in a previous video, but these researchers created a mouse utopia, and it kind of went through an arc. I guess it was sort of like a petri dish in a way, but the minds of the mice just kind of imploded. They their behavior just became erratic. All this abundance and everything, they just couldn't handle it. So, but those conditions were artificially imposed on them. Yeah, so when a small number of people, a relatively small number of people, just kind of dictate for everybody else, they can force them into these unnatural situations. Like I said, the hardware of the human doesn't change. There's certain things that, the limits of human endurance are finite. Like this movie, A Clockwork Orange, that came out, I think it was in the 70s. It was a dystopian movie. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. But like, these people are living in a society that they just don't know what to do with themselves, I think. My old roommate Frank, whom I've mentioned before, I had some conversations with him. He was in his mid-50s and I was 18 when we lived together, and he's been dead for probably 25 years or so, and he was an orphan. So nobody really, he has no real legacy. I think maybe there's probably some people who know him superficially who are still around. Anyway, we would get in these conversations, and he did ask me what I thought people would do in such a situation of abundance. And it's like there are these extremes of pleasure and pain that people, I think, would explore. Like, pleasure is a thing that you would endure, that you can endure, like pain. Like, not everybody can endure that much pleasure. There's definitely a saturation point to it. And same, I guess, goes with pain. Makes me think of Clive Barker and his dimension, where this Leviathan rules and is served by these Cenobites who help people explore, like, the outer limits of experience. So imagine you were the sun, and your light shines on these orbiters, and one of them that's just properly placed has this moss growing on it, and it's converting your energy. It takes your energy and forms into something, and that something is conscious. And for the longest time, the face of this thing was just responding to conditions directly. And there was no like symmetry at the macro level on this thing, this marble. But all of a sudden, at some point, something appears on it, like something novel appears on this marble, and like structures with visible symmetry start to emerge, and like a colony that can be seen at well, the sun never sees the lights of the electricity, I suppose, because it's just it's always at night, and then during day any lights would be swamped out. But this emergence of this novelty is a product of a different kind of energy utilization within the organisms. So, like, for example, mammals and reptiles. Reptiles get more of their energy directly from the sun. They can heat and cool. They heat and cool themselves more from the ambience, the ambient conditions. Whereas we have like a little chemical fire going. I mean, they do too, but we really rely on metabolizing to get our energy. We eat a lot more than like lizards and crocodiles and turtles. We move a lot more generally. They stay still a lot more than we do. So they're more efficient in a sense. So this sort of higher pace of activity that mammals exhibit somehow gave rise to this brain, because the brain eats up a ton of energy. And then this relational awareness that can imagine things being different than they are, that emerges and creates this path of novelty. And so we should really be considerate of the constant in the equation of technological progress, right? So this thread of novelty that goes through time, that's created by human beings, it impacts us, and we should really consider the unchanging aspects of the human being, and be aware of them, because those are what manifest the those points along the arc of history that stand out, like great atrocities. There's something in the human nature given certain conditions that cause this to happen. I've talked about it in the past. Certainly one is a technological edge, when the imaginations of one insular group conjure something that can overpower, that can give them the ability to overpower another group. This hardwiring, this imperative to this, to be expansionist, will get its opportunity. So that's one. And then another would be concentration of power. Because, the few can't accommodate the perspectives of the many, especially if the few have some insular conditioning, whatever it may be. It's everywhere and at all times when the opportunity arises. And it'll never leave us, because although one individual can break the unconscious identification with the root of the ego that from which all conditioning grows or sort of accumulates, that can never be like a universal condition, because the probability of it happening, it's just not uniform. Somebody had asked me this question in the comments. I did a video where I talked about the world being a vineyard of energy bodies, right? And all those, the planet is a confluence of different vibrational levels, like different energy bodies. You're in the same three-dimensional plane as others, but you're all carrying different vibrational levels depending on how your conditioning relates to circumstance. And they asked if this was like the destiny for everybody. And I can only speak from experience. So many things are speculative, because anything that's experienced is just a projection of the mind. So no matter how real an experience, it could very well just be a dream, right? There's just no, hence like simulation theory, Things only need to be relatively solid to seem solid from an observer's perspective, right? So you've probably heard that things aren't as solid as they appear, meaning that like the volume that an atom holds is a lot of space, but there are probabilities involved. Anyway, so you have these different levels of consciousness within the population, between individuals, between groups, to the extent that what makes you part of a group is contingent upon holding some set of conditioning, some set of beliefs. The light of reality shines through that conditioning in a way that can set your vibrational level. And so, a group can indeed have a certain sort of flavor of energy body if they are insular enough to maintain a set of beliefs that really has bearing on their behavior, their view. But the question of whether or not we will all go through this, I can't answer. If there's reincarnation, then it's certainly not the like granular conditioning of the ego, because when you die, you're losing everything, right? Memories are falling away. hence the saying, to die before you die. To lose identity with the conditioned self like that is a kind of death, but it's a conscious a death of which there's an awareness, and it's not the same thing as like a disavowing of something. It's not like that. It's more of a realization. A certain space appears between what's aware and what appears in awareness that exposes the non-self nature of the latter, and it changes the way that reality is reacted to, because there's not a sense of being that vulnerable thing for which there was previously fear. So that that can't happen to everybody, because it's like there's a breaking that has to happen, perhaps. I can only speak from my own experience, and I have to speak in duality to make it make sense. But it's like a circumstance can arise in a life, everything comes together a certain way, and for me, like I've said in other videos, it was just I had a lot of unwanted thoughts, and I learned how to deal with them, these particular unwanted thoughts. But in doing that, it gave kind of a general formula for dealing with all of them. And what can't be known experientially going into it is what's going to happen energetically when the energy that underlies those thoughts starts sort of being repurposed, because attention is no longer getting plugged into the content that was sort of the skin of that energy. So it kind of falls away, and these types of changes in inner perception, they give insight. So it's not going to happen in every lifetime. So if there is reincarnation, then what would persist after the physical death would be an energy body. So that energy body, like, though the three-dimensional world is this confluence of different physical bodies containing different levels of energy body, when that body dissolves, that energy body is going to stratify. So I mentioned before how, like, different types of mental objects occur at different vibrational levels in consciousness, right? So a person who, just for ease of communication, vibrates at a low level, they're going to have a head full of unpleasantries. But they are in the same physical plane as an enlightened being who has no reaction to impermanence. The impermanence of things does not change the way this being vibrates, because they have no sense of being anything that has a stake in things. So those two beings, upon the dissolution of the physical body, would then stratify to their respective levels. And so this is not, I'm not making all this up. This is, some of it comes from like the Pali Canon. I think the Buddha talks about non-returners, different types of experiences that I guess the jiva, to use a Hindu term, would go through. But I talked to an old man once, and his mind was still keyed into all of the pleasures of the flesh. He said if he could get a new body, he'd be ready to just do it all again. So imagine if a mind like that were to become a disembodied spirit, like in the Bardo. That would be a hungry ghost. So it would want to get back into those experiences, and thus it would seek to find a body. Now, those energy bodies, they feed on their vibrational level. So a lower vibrating energy body, the mind associated with such, the mind that perpetuates that vibrational level is more like a mushroom and less like a plant. So a plant, it can photosynthesize. It gets its energy from the sun. It gets its energy from something like a field, kind of. And yeah, it does, of course, take minerals from the ground, but it doesn't have to necessarily predate. But some do. Whereas a mushroom, it doesn't need the sun, because, it doesn't need the sun to photosynthesize because it doesn't photosynthesize. So when there's mind identification, that sustenance is not believed to come from the truth, just from exposure to the light of the truth. That spiritual sustenance is believed to come from experiences that bring attention into the moment, and that juice that comes from that alignment it's typically not going to be identified as being from that alignment, but rather from that object. So those types of jivas are going to gravitate towards their vibrational level, right? This like attracts like from an energetic perspective. The person you sit with who has to talk shit about other people because that brings them to their vibrational level, and they want to get you in on that too. Because they want your juice. They want the energy that follows your attention, but they want it filtered through their, the correct lens to give them that vibrational level. So this theory in Buddhism is that the body is going to get pulled into, a like vibrational level. It's not just Buddhism, and it might not even really be like in Buddhism described the way that I'm describing it, but the idea of reincarnation, this idea of karma. Karma is the mind, is what Ramana Maharshi said. And, to the extent that while in body identification, the contents of the mind color the energy body, the level of the energy body, it determines the place of the next incarnation. So the doors into the material world, there are entrances at different vibrational levels, and they pop into reality in different places, and that's how karma works, from a birth and death perspective. And so these different hells are deprivations, because in the unconscious state there's a separation from source, and so it makes one subject to desire, and that persists, theoretically, with or without the body, the food body. So to the original question of, is this, what happens to us all, not within any one lifetime. I guess that's all for now.